I now welcome our first witnesses for today, Ms Elaine Pearson in person and Ms Yachao Wang, joining from video conference from the United States. Thank you very much for joining us, I think, in New York evening time. For the Hansard record, could you please each state your name and give the capacity in which you appear today?
Yep, my name is Elaine Pearson. I'm the Asia Director of Human Rights Watch.
And my name is Yachao Wang. I'm a senior China researcher for Human Rights Watch.
Thanks, Ms Wong, and I understand you wish to make an opening statement on behalf of Human Rights Watch.
Thank you, Senator Paterson, and thank you to the Australian Parliament for the opportunity to testify on this important issue. I watched the hearing yesterday, and some of the key issues have been covered, especially on TikTok. So today I will just make two complementary points. First is on the relationship between the Chinese private companies and the Chinese government. I wanted to make it unequivocally clear. All Chinese companies, private or public, are subject to the control of the Chinese Communist Party. So for Chinese social media companies, this creates an opportunity and a mechanism for CCP censorship, surveillance, and propaganda that affect not only their users based in China, but around the world, including in Australia. The CCP has a record of compelling domestic and foreign companies to toe the party line and punishing those who failed to sufficiently do so. It has forcefully disappeared a score of business executives under murky circumstances, a practice that has only increased in recent years under President Xi Jinping. Some of those disappeared business executives have never been heard from again. Some have returned to work as if nothing had happened. Some ended up going to prison. Some even mysteriously died or incarcerated. All this sends a clear message to business leaders in China that the price of opposing or even appearing to oppose the CCP can be extraordinarily steep. The second point I want to make is about WeChat. One thing that I really want the general public in Australia to take in is the centrality of WeChat in information acquisition and in communication among the Chinese diaspora, especially among the first-generation immigrants from China. People not only read WeChat to know about what is going on in China, but also what is going on in Australia. Some of the most popular publications catering to the diaspora primarily publish on WeChat. And in order to attract readership, traditional Chinese language news outlets now also publish through WeChat. In this sense, news produced by, let's say, a local Chinese language outlet in Sydney has to go through censors in Beijing before it reaches the Chinese-speaking community in Sydney. Because of WeChat's central role in Chinese diaspora's digital life, and because of the control the CCP exerts over Chinese tech companies, WeChat should be a special concern for Australia, the country that has one of the largest Chinese diaspora by percentage. In our written submission, we have made a few recommendations, but given the time limit, I will just mention two in response to the 2 points I just made. First is to call for the Australian Parliament to create regulations that require transparency from all social media companies, including disclosure of their content moderation policies and enforcement, such as what content they have censored, suppressed, and promoted at the requests of governments. Second is to call for the Australian government to support independent and professional Chinese language journalism and expand the sources of uncensored news for Chinese language speakers. In Australia, we have ABC Chinese, we have SBS Chinese. They, as traditional media, are doing great work, but we need more, especially on social media platforms, because that's where people get their information now. I will stop here. Thank you.
Ms Wong, thank you very much for that opening statement. That was very helpful and covered a lot of very relevant ground for the committee. There are a couple of issues straight off from your opening statement which I want to follow up, and then I'll offer the call to the Deputy Chair, Senator Walsh, for any questions she may have. I thought it was particularly important the way in which you talked about how the party in China exercises control over private companies. As you point out, and as other witnesses have also said, there's not just one avenue for party control, there's multiple avenues. There's, as you say, threatening to put people in jail or actually putting people in jail who run companies, which obviously has a very powerful incentive for them. There is legislation which applies to the companies, national security laws and other things. There's party cells in large companies. There's often a strategic stake by government entities in large companies. All of these things obviously give the party an opportunity to exert control. But nonetheless, despite this evidence, some Chinese technology companies still assert in Western media their independence from the Chinese state. TikTok, for example, contests that that ByteDance is even a Chinese headquartered company. They say their headquarters is global and they're not headquartered in China at all, and there's no one from the party involved in running the company or making decisions. Just for clarity, is there any credibility to those sort of arguments? Should we treat those arguments seriously at all?
I don't think so. I think we need to differentiate that the Chinese Communist Party has control over company. That's unequivocally clear. But it doesn't exercise control all the time. That's two different things. You know, the companies can make decisions in terms of, they want to promote happy content instead of, political protests. That's their decisions. They often do it themselves. But when the party wants to make the companies do something, the companies has to do it. But most of the time, the Chinese government doesn't necessarily want to say, you have to do this and you have to do that. But when it wants, it can. I think I wanted to make that clear.
Yes, that's a really important point. I don't think anyone's suggesting that the party is sitting there directing every commercial activity of these companies, but equally, those companies certainly don't do things which the party does not approve of, and they don't go contrary to the interests of the party, because otherwise they wouldn't be allowed to continue to operate freely, as many Chinese business leaders have discovered to their disadvantage.
Exactly. I mean, for Chinese social media companies, they often proactive censor because they know that if I don't censor well, if I don't do it as soon as possible, I will be punished later. And they don't want this to happen. So they often proactively censor before even the party tells them to censor certain information, especially when, let's say, in recent days, a big fire happened in Beijing, and people are talking about why the fire happened, how many people died, and the social media came quickly overnight. They wanted to get rid of this content before Beijing tells them you have to get rid of the company, because they want to survive, they want to make money, they wanted to their company to continue to operate. So companies do that proactively often.
That's also a really good point. That's the fear of an authoritarian state. Citizens have to anticipate what the state might want them to do, and they have to proactively act, because if they don't, the consequences are very dire. And in the case of ByteDance, this is not just a theoretical exercise. As you'd be probably familiar, early in its history, it ran afoul of China's government censors because of one of its apps operating within China. And its founder, Zhang Yiming, published a kind of grovelling apology to the party very early in its tenure, and one of the things he said he promised to do is uphold, socialist teaching on his platforms. So it's not a theoretical concern. Moving on to your point about WeChat, look, your perspective on that is really valued and will be of interest to the committee, because this is an issue that we're wrestling with, to be candid. WeChat has made itself to be a very important tool for Chinese diaspora communities in countries like Australia. It is very widely used and valued by many Chinese Australians. But obviously you make very good points about the censorship and control that exists on the platform. What can liberal democracies do about platforms like that without adversely affecting the interests of a minority community that utilises it?
Well, I think, first of all, governments really need to force companies to be transparent about what they're censoring, what they're suppressing, what they're promoting. This is something that can be done without adversely affecting how people use the app. And we're not even at that stage. For Australian users, make force WeChat to be public. What kind of information you're censoring within Australia? What kind of information you're promoting? What kind of requests you get from the Chinese government to censor certain content in Australia? Those are, the Australian government has the power to force WeChat to be transparent about those that kind of information. Secondly, as I mentioned in the recommendation, there are so much disinformation within the WeChat world. So it's critical that, for the Australian government to provide accurate, independent, professional journalism, so people have alternative to go to instead of, watching or reading the propaganda information from Beijing or censored information from Beijing. As I said, Australia already has ABC Chinese language, SBS Chinese language. I know the journalists in those outlets, and they do great work. We, Human Rights Watch, and them communicate often. But the fact is that a lot of people today, they don't necessarily go watch TV and go to ABC's website to read the news. They read what's going on Twitter, on WeChat, on TikTok, on Instagram. So we needed to think about how do we push those information through those platforms that people actually use.
Yeah, thank you. Two really good points, and I do agree with you about the importance of Chinese language media in Australia that's not controlled by the party, particularly the ABC, SBS services, which I think are very important. To your point about imposing requirements on applications to be transparent about their censorship, you're right, that's untested. We haven't tried to do that in Australia. How likely do you think it is that a company like WeChat could and would comply with something like that? I imagine that would cause them difficulties with the Chinese government because they wouldn't want that to be transparent. And the only case study we have which is related in Australia is when WeChat first censored and then ultimately deplatformed Prime Minister Scott Morrison ahead of the last election, and then was unresponsive to the Australian government request that his account be restored. If that's the approach that they're taking to compliance with Australian government directions, I'm concerned they might not comply with this.
Well, I that's my concern too. For example, when there's an order from the Australian government because of their legislations force them to disclose certain information, and there's an order from the Chinese government telling them not to disclose certain information, they are going to go to follow the order from the Chinese government because that's, the company is a Chinese company. Their livelihood is hinged to the Chinese Communist Party. So, but if they don't comply, then there should be, clause in the law say that if you don't comply, what is going to happen? For example, if you don't comply, you have to move out of Australia. Then, move out of Australia. You have to comply with laws.
So you ultimately think that something as severe as a ban needs to be on the table as a mechanism of getting compliance with less severe restrictions like transparency obligations?
Well, I think we should go first. The first step, let's say, make the companies transparent, force them to disclose the stuff they censor, promote. Then let's go from there. I don't necessarily, Human Rights Watch doesn't like to advocate bans because it concerns freedom of speech. So let's go to the first step first, and let's see what happens and how WeChat is going to respond to that. And that's because I'm a member of the Chinese diaspora. I know so many people rely on the app for anything. People have family members in China. If you wanted to talk to your parents, you have to use WeChat because Instagram, WhatsApp, everything else is banned. So WeChat is important. We have to think about that. It's a critical tool for communication between the diaspora and with China. So let's not go to the ban. Let's try what we have not tried, and that do not have a adverse impact on the diaspora. Let's try that first.
Yeah, Dr. Seth Cap. Sorry, this person. Yeah.
Sorry, just wanted to add in one point. I think the penalties that would be imposed by the government, I think that's up to the government to decide what those penalties would be. But I think there is also a really important role that the Australian government can play in ensuring that the acts of intimidation and harassment and censorship that occur on apps like WeChat are publicised. And I think, communities, Chinese language communities in Australia, they need to be aware of that. And it shouldn't just be up to civil society organisations or think tanks really to be disclosing these incidents. I mean, we documented a lot of this in the report that Human Rights Watch put out in June of 2021, looking at particularly the experiences of Chinese students and students from Taiwan and Hong Kong studying in Australia, and the extent to which, their experience is really filtered through this WeChat bubble. But we documented numerous incidents, for instance, where students were threatened by other members in a WeChat group with being reported to the Chinese consulate because of statements that they had made expressing support for Hong Kong democracy, for instance. And, I think for the universities, particularly back then, it was very unclear what steps they should be taking. So I think, we need to also think about, these institutions where there are large numbers of Chinese students, they need to be very proactive in making it very clear that acts of intimidation, harassment, censorship, will not be tolerated, as well as making aware to these communities that there are alternative ways that they can access information about what's happening in Australia, about what's happening in China.
Yeah, really good points, Mrs. Pearson. I'll offer the call to the Deputy Chair, and if there's time, I might come back with some more. Thank you.